The small town of Willow Creek sat nestled between rolling golden fields and the slow, winding bends of the Mississippi River. It was the kind of place where the diner still had red leather stools, where kids raced their bikes down Main Street without a second thought, and where neighbors didn't just wave at each other. They knew the names of each other's dogs, the birthdays of each other's kids, and sometimes even the secret troubles hiding behind polite smiles. But beneath its Norman Rockwell charm, Willow Creek was a town balancing on the edge of change. Factories had closed, jobs had dried up. Families who had called this place home for generations were quietly packing moving trucks, chasing work in bigger cities. Those who stayed behind fought hard, sometimes too hard, to preserve what they had. And sometimes in their fight to protect what mattered, they forgot what mattered most. At the center of this unfolding story stood Ethan Cole, a high school senior whose quiet determination made him different from the rest. He wasn't the quarterback, or the class clown, or the kid everyone knew by name. He was the one who stayed late after class, helping the janitor clean up spilled paint, the one who walked his little sister home from school when his mom worked overtime at the diner, the one who dreamed of something more, but didn't quite know how to get there. Ethan's world was about to collide with a test, one that had nothing to do with college applications, SAT scores, or scholarships. It was a test of character, of courage, and of what it really means to choose between right and wrong when the lines blur. That test began on an autumn evening, with the air sharp enough to carry the scent of wood smoke from half a mile away, when Ethan stumbled across something that would ripple through Willow Creek and force everyone, including himself, to face truths they weren't ready for. It started like this. Ethan was walking home from the diner, his backpack heavy with textbooks, his hands stuffed into his jacket against the chill. He usually took the well-lit route past the post office, but tonight, feeling restless, he cut through Miller's Field, a shortcut across the old fairgrounds. Most folks avoided the place after dark. The wooden booths where cotton candy had once been sold leaned like worn shoulders, and the Ferris wheel, abandoned long ago, stood rusting against the night sky like a skeleton reaching for the stars. As Ethan walked, he heard something, a low groan. At first, he thought it was the wind working through the Ferris wheel spokes, but then he heard it again, closer. Human. He froze. The sound came from the shadows near the old ticket booth, and when Ethan stepped closer, he saw him, Mr. Jennings, the town's wealthiest businessman, slumped against the wood, blood trickling from his forehead. Jennings owned half the rental properties in town, the car dealership on Main, and a reputation for being both feared and disliked. He was the kind of man who cut deals in whispers, evicted families without blinking, and smiled in church pews on Sunday as though generosity flowed through his veins. "Help me," Jennings rasped. Ethan's heart hammered. Instinct told him to run, to get an adult, to call 911. But then, as Jennings tried to lift himself, a small black notebook fell from his coat pocket, landing in the dirt at Ethan's feet. The boy picked it up without thinking. He shouldn't have, he knew it, but curiosity has a way of gripping tighter than fear. Flipping it open, Ethan's eyes widened. Names, dates, numbers. At first it looked like nothing but scribbles, but then he realized these were records. Payments, some with dollar signs, some with arrows, some circled in red ink, and beside them initials he recognized. People from Willow Creek. People who had struggled, lost jobs, and lost homes. Families who had always whispered that Jennings was pulling strings to his own advantage. Ethan's throat got dry. In his hands was proof, maybe not just of greed, but of something bigger, darker. And in front of him was the man who had built an empire on the backs of struggling families, now bleeding and asking for help. For a long second, Ethan just stood there. The choice gnawed at him. Drop the notebook, help the man, and pretend he'd never seen it. Or hold on, knowing this could change everything in Willow Creek. Knowing it could also destroy lives, including his own family's. That night, in the silence of Miller's Field, A moral storm began to churn inside him. Because sometimes the hardest choices aren't between right and wrong. They're between two rights or two wrongs, and the cost of either could change everything. Ethan stood frozen, notebook in hand, his breath fogging the night air. Mr. Jennings groaned again, clutching at his side. The boy's instincts warred within him, compassion on one shoulder, justice on the other. Finally, Ethan shoved the notebook into his backpack, knelt down, and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling an ambulance," he said, his voice shaking. Jennings' eyes flittered open, sharp even in his pain. "No hospital," he rasped. His hand shot out, surprisingly strong, gripping Ethan's wrist. Not a word about this. But Ethan pressed 911 anyway. Within minutes, flashing lights washed over the abandoned fairgrounds. Paramedics loaded Jennings onto a stretcher, his protests drowned out by oxygen masks and medical jargon. The police took Ethan's statement, just a boy who happened upon an injured man. They didn't ask many questions, and he didn't offer answers. Yet the notebook weighed heavier in his bag than the textbooks ever had. The next morning, Willow Creek buzzed with rumors. Some said Jennings had fallen, others whispered it was a fight. Nobody knew the truth, and Jennings wasn't talking. What people did know was that the man was alive, recovering in the hospital, and already threatening to sue the fairground owners for unsafe property conditions. Ethan barely touched his breakfast. Across the table, his mother, exhausted from the diner's night shift, sipped weak coffee. His little sister Lily chattered about a spelling test, and all Ethan could think about was the initials in that notebook, initials that matched neighbors who had lost homes, his friend's dad who'd been evicted, and the widow down the street who now worked 2 jobs. That night, while the house slept, Ethan sat at his desk with the notebook. Each page painted a clearer picture. Backroom deals, inflated rents, quiet payoffs. It wasn't illegal in the way a crime show might show it, but it was worse. Systematic exploitation dressed up as business. Jennings had hollowed out Willow Creek from the inside. The boy's stomach twisted. If he turned the notebook over to the police, what then? Jennings was powerful and connected. Who would believe a teenager against a businessman with lawyers? But if he stayed quiet, wasn't he just as guilty? 2 days later, Ethan found himself confiding in Clara Reed, his history teacher. Clara was one of the few adults in town who encouraged students to question things, to think beyond textbooks. He stayed after class, pulling the notebook from his bag with trembling hands. "Miss Reed," he whispered, "I need your advice." Her eyes scanned the pages, her brow furrowing deeper with every turn. When she finally looked up, her voice was low. "Ethan, do you realize what this means?" "I don't know what to do. If I tell the truth, Jennings will crush me. My mom rents from him. He could throw us out. But if I don't," his voice cracked, "people will keep suffering." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight with our conscience. You need to decide what kind of man you want to be, Ethan. Do you want to live safe or live right?" Her words echoed in his chest like a bell. The choice became even harder when Jennings' men showed up. 3 days after the accident, a sleek black car pulled up outside Ethan's school. A man in a tailored suit waited by the door. "Ethan Cole?" he asked smoothly. Ethan's heart skipped. "My employer, Mr. Jennings, appreciates your discretion," he said. He handed Ethan a crisp envelope, a small token of gratitude. Ethan didn't open it until he was alone. Inside, a stack of $100 bills, more money than he'd ever seen, enough to pay his mom's overdue bills and maybe even replace her broken-down car. But at the bottom of the envelope was a note. Forget what you saw. Ethan stared at the bills until his hands shook. Was silence worth this much? Could he really buy peace of mind? That night, he slipped the envelope under his mattress, unable to throw it away, unable to spend it, unable to escape it. The turning point came a week later at the town council meeting. Jennings had returned, bandaged but arrogant as ever, railing against the dilapidated fairgrounds and demanding the land be sold to him for redevelopment. Ethan sat in the back row, clutching the notebook in his backpack. His neighbors filled the seats, nodding or shaking their heads, powerless as Jennings spun his story. Finally, Clara Reed stood up. "This town deserves better," she said firmly. "We deserve transparency." Jennings sneered. "And what do you propose, Miss Reed? Fairy tales? Hearsay?" The council prepared to move on, but Ethan rose, his legs trembling. "I have proof," he said, his voice louder than he thought possible. Every head turned. Jennings' smile froze. Slowly, Ethan pulled the notebook from his bag and placed it on the council's table. Gasps rippled through the room. The boy's heart pounded as he spoke. "This isn't about one accident. It's about years of lies. Families lost homes because of what's in there. People deserve to know the truth." The council president flipped the pages, her face paling. Jennings lunged forward, shouting, but townspeople surged from their seats, demanding answers. Chaos erupted. Reporters scribbled notes, phones snapped photos, and Jennings, for the first time in memory, looked cornered. The fallout was swift and brutal. Investigations opened. Lawyers descended. Jennings' empire began to crumble under the weight of exposure. For the first time, Willow Creek saw cracks in the armor of the man who had held it hostage for decades. But for Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. Within a week, his family received an eviction notice. "Failure to comply with lease agreements," the letter read. Everyone knew it was a retaliation. The Coles packed their belongings into boxes, neighbors helping quietly, some whispering apologies. But something else happened too. For the first time, the town didn't just whisper about Jennings' cruelty, they acted. A petition circulated. Families offered the Coles a spare room, a job lead, and a donated truck. People who had been silent found their voices. Ethan realized something powerful. Courage is contagious. Months later, after courts froze Jennings' assets and prosecutors circled, Willow Creek began to heal. Small businesses reopened, the council voted to renovate the fairgrounds for community use, and Ethan, once just a quiet boy walking home through the shadows, found himself seen in a new light. Not as a hero, but as someone who had chosen conscience over comfort. At graduation, Clara Reed hugged him tight. "You've learned something many adults never do," she whispered. "That the measure of a man isn't what he earns, but what he stands for." Ethan smiled, his gaze drifting over the crowd. His mom, proud despite exhaustion. His sister was waving from the front row. His neighbors, standing taller than before. And he thought Willow Creek had always been worth saving. In the quiet corners of life, we are often handed choices that test more than our abilities. They test our hearts. Ethan Cole could have chosen silence. He could have chosen safety. Instead, he chose truth, knowing it might cost him everything. That's the moral that lingers long after Willow Creek's story ends. Doing the right thing is rarely the easiest path, but it is always the one that leads to change. For in the end, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to stand, trembling but unbroken, in the face of it. And sometimes that courage can light the way for an entire community.